I remember one thing that always confused me about the founding of Arnor and Gondor. Where did all the people come from? After all, only 9 ships escaped from Numenor, so how did these 9 ships bring enough people to found 2 kingdoms, which would then go on to fight a massive war only 100 years later? If your reading is only surface deep, and believe me, you shouldn't feel bad if it is, then this might seem like a mistake in Tolkien's world building. But it's not, and I'm going to tell you why. So, how were Gondor and Arnor founded? So as I said previously, 9 ships escaped the downfall of Numenor, 5 went to Gondor, 4 went to Arnor. Even if we assume that these ships are massive ships, that's really only a couple of thousand people at most. A couple of thousand people isn't enough to found 5 cities: Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, Osgiliath, Annúminas and Fornos Dorain. They'd be more like 5 villages. And a couple of thousand people isn't enough people to then go and fight a war that involves tens of thousands of soldiers only 100 years later, especially for Numenoreans, as 100 years is only really 1 generation or so. But all these people didn't just appear out of thin air. The answer? Almost all of the people of Gondor and Arnor already lived there when Elendil and his sons arrived. I've mentioned this in my previous videos that the Numenoreans colonised and then gained dominion over much of the coasts of Middle-earth, and this was an effort that lasted over 2,000 years. The first Numenorean settlement in Middle-earth was Londare, at the mouth of the river Gwathlo. This haven was founded by Tar Aldarion, sometime around the 8th century of the Second Age. This is Numenor's only settlement in Middle-earth for many years, but in 1200 of the Second Age, they begin to construct permanent havens in other places. In some ways, you could liken this to the European colonisation of the New World. The first settlements took a long time to get going, but once they got going, colonisation efforts rapidly increased. In the early years of the 3rd millennium of the Second Age, other cities begin to pop up as well. Umbar is founded in 2280 and Peligir is founded in 2350. And Peligir becomes the chief haven of the Faithful. So this indicates that by this point the Numenoreans are capable of founding and supporting large cities. At the minimum, we have tens of thousands of Numenorean settlers living in these regions, which probably means that the total Numenorean population living in Middle-earth is now in the hundreds of thousands, if not more. As Numenor becomes more hostile for the Faithful, more of them migrate to Middle-earth. This is especially true in Argamilzor's reign, who rules in the 32nd century of the Second Age. One notable group of Faithful who migrate around this time end up settling in Belfalas, and would eventually found the city of Dol Amroth. So by the time Elendil becomes leader of the Faithful, which is 150 years later, it's very likely that the majority of the Faithful lived in Middle-earth and not in Numenor, and these Faithful have had many years to multiply and number and spread across the wide lands that would eventually become Gondor and Arnor. So when Elendil and his sons arrive in the lands that would become Gondor and Arnor, they are welcomed by a large population of Numenoreans, some of which had been living in those lands for over 1,000 years. So even in terms of Numenorean lifespans, that's at least 10 generations of people. And I also want to point out that it's not just Numenoreans who live in those lands, but also middle men. Men who are descendants of the Edain, the ancestors of the Numenoreans. These exist in Gondor, especially in western Gondor. Some of them are hostile towards Gondor, namely the Men of the Mountains who Isildur would later curse, but many of them are integrated into Gondorian society and would make up large parts of lands such as Lossarnach, Lebanon and Anfalas. Arnor also has plenty of middle men, those men who live in Minhiriath or around Bree, but also the hillmen who reside in what would later be known as Rhudaur. Notably, Arnor's Numenorean population seemed to be significantly less than Gondor's, and these middle men greatly outnumbered the Numenoreans in many parts of the kingdom. When Elendil and his sons officially found Gondor and Arnor, they also found a bunch of new cities: Annúminas, Fornost, and the town of Farbad in Arnor, and Osgiliath, Minas Anor, and Minas Ithil in Gondor. You might wonder, well, hang on, if there were so many people, why didn't these cities exist before? Well, these lands were simple colonies beforehand, whereas now they were supposed to be proper kingdoms, and proper kingdoms need proper administrative and trade centres. These cities were built to be seats of power, as now the lands of Gondor and Arnor were on their own, without the might of Numenor behind them. Osgiliath was built in a strategic location, allowing for both sides of the Anduin to be controlled, and Minas Anor and Minas Ithil, doubling as both cities and as fortresses, were built on either side of Osgiliath. Minas Ithil to defend against the threat from Mordor, and Minas Anor to defend from the threat of the Men of the Mountains. Likewise, in the north, Annúminas is built deep in Arnor's territory, next to Lake Evendim and far from any threats. Fornost is built in the North Downs, seemingly as a bulwark against any threats from the east, and Tharbad is built as an important border and trading post between Gondor and Arnor. These great construction works and an efficient organising of their realms would allow for both Arnor and Gondor to become major powers merely 100 years into their existence, and they would be strong enough to play a major part in overthrowing Sauron at the end of the Second Age. For Gondor, this was just the beginning of what could be described as a golden age that would last for 1,000 years, but for Arnor it was the beginning of a steep decline. The circumstances of both of these kingdoms would be completely different, and they would both face a unique set of problems as the Third Age continued. Before I end the video, I want to point out something interesting that highlights how far Middle-earth had fallen in the late Third Age compared to the late Second Age. Of those 5 cities I mentioned that were founded at the end of the Second Age, only Minas Anor, soon to be known as Minas Tirith, would remain populated. Annúminas and Fornost were deserted ruins, Minas Ithil was captured by Sauron and became Minas Morgul, and Osgiliath was a contested war zone. Even places like Tharbad and Lon-Dare were ruined. Interestingly enough, Peligir, the first city founded by the Faithful, far outlasted all of the rest, so maybe Peligir was the place to be. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I enjoyed talking about the world building of Tolkien's world. There's enough information to give an idea, but not so much as to take away the mystery that surrounds a lot of those ideas. Just like a lot of our own history. War in Middle-earth will be back next, this time in the Third Age, so stay tuned for that, and remember, if you're planning on founding a city, maybe take advice from an Arion before Isildur.